The year is 1920. Everyone has returned from war, and women have contributed greatly during World War I, when the country needed them most. Men are fearing that women will change the world they themselves live in, and in many ways they will. There will continue to be rapid change in the United States, especially for women. As a reward for helping during the war while men were away, women are given the right to vote and equal rights to men with the passing of the 19th Amendment. After being given the right to vote, women form a League of Women Voters, which gives them continual impact on society and encourages more women to express their right to vote. Women do begin to vote more and more, and in 1925 the first woman is elected into government. Nellie Taylor Ross is put in place as chief executive in Wyoming. 2 weeks later, Miriam Ferguson is given the same position in Texas. As for the continual changing political status for women, there is also an increase in their say in their marriages. With this now being a factor, the divorce rate increases by more than half. Women are no longer accepting men being in charge. There is now a more accepting image of women smoking in public, as men have been allowed to do for a long time before. The changing atmosphere allows for new ideas to be presented, such as Sunday not being just for church. There was now more Sunday movies and baseball games that become socially acceptable. Fashion for women during this time changes dramatically, from a conservatively dressed society to women having dresses go up to their knees. Makeup also becomes very common amongst women. It becomes socially acceptable for them to wear it. Women are said to have used a pound of makeup in a year. Women who became known as flappers make their appearance. They have skirts that are even shorter than knee length. Flappers are described as wearing a lot of makeup, having short bobbed hair, almost man-like, and again, wearing questionably length skirts. Flappers were known as being lovely, but having expensive taste. They liked dancing as long as it wasn't a boring dance, and riding in new automobiles that went fast. Eugene Kelly becomes known as the first flapper, and every other woman in America wanted to become just like her. The early definition of a flapper was known as a young woman, especially during in conduct, speech, and dress. The flapper became known as the new woman. She dominated the 1920s. There are terrible stories of girls being driven to ruin. One 14-year-old girl committed suicide after her mother refuses to let her wear her flapper clothing. Flapper Jane represented the new woman, and it was questioned whether or not she actually existed. She was said to be 19 years old. The Prohibition movement had been going on before World War I, but after the war had ended, there was an anti-German sentiment in the United States. Breweries had been linked to German names mostly, and so began the need to eliminate alcohol usage within America. The 18th Amendment prohibited the consumption and distribution of alcohol. It was set in place on January 16, 1920. With the new 18th Amendment came the Volstead Act. It enforced the new amendment that had been passed. 500,000 people were arrested between 1920 and 1930 for violating the Volstead Act. Judy O'Grady and the Colonial Ladies were a few of 50,000 women who got involved in the bootleg business. These women became known as the Ladies of Rum Row. More than 25,000 women are arrested for taking part in this. The ages of women involved range from 6 to 60 years old. This is just another example of the new woman and her involvement in society and not being willing to hold back any longer. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act become the most disliked and most disobeyed in the history of the nation. Many began brewing their own bathtub gin or home brew as a popular pastime. Smuggling liquor into the United States became a substantial business. Much of it came from Canada and Mexico. Anyone who would sell liquor to a customer who would otherwise follow the law was known as a bootlegger. It became known to have one's own bootlegger during this time period. Those who tried to catch these bootleggers were known as prohibition agents. Prohibition agents became seen as a joke and were not well funded by Congress, who seemed so enthusiastic to enforce the Volstead Act. Prohibition was an act to try to control the amount of alcohol consumed by citizens in the United States, promoted mostly by Protestants. The act would be in place until 1933, when Americans decided that it was a failed attempt and had only made the smuggling of alcohol a new normal for the United States. The 1920s becomes known as the Jazz Age. Throughout the mid-1920s, jazz becomes a more respectable music for people to listen to and dance to. Jazz music was always present in the United States from the African American influence, but gets more recognition after World War I. America has a unique contribution to the Jazz Age. This influence spread not only rapidly across the United States, but all over the world. The jazz influence began in big cities like New Orleans, Chicago, and New York. The spirit of the Jazz Age is exemplified by F. Scott Fitzgerald's view of life. His opinion helped the Jazz Age to grow. Many musician names began to appear everywhere, including W.C. Handy, Bix Beiderbecke, Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, and Duke Ellington. Jazz concerts started becoming more popular thanks to many led by Paul Whitman. He had one of the large popular bands, and when he teamed with young composer and pianist George Gershwin, a new era began. The Jazz Age would continue to influence the 1920s throughout the time period. Prohibition, the Jazz Age, and the New Woman all shaped the time period and the roles played within society. The cultural changes during this time is hard for some to accept, with women gaining the right to vote and being able to do certain things the same as men. It causes an entirely new America to emerge. There were some not so positive things to emerge during this time as well. The Ku Klux Klan formed in 1915, taking its name from the South during Reconstruction days. They reached their largest amount of members in 1924 and became an anti-immigrant, anti-Negro group. There was also the Red Scare after World War I, along with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. There was fear that an uprising might come to the United States. Communism, socialism, and anarchy was a fear amongst Americans during this time. There was a belief that there were spies living amongst the everyday man. This became the time of reporters. During the Jazz Age, there were many murder investigations, therefore being many stories for reporters. With everything changing in the world so quickly, there were plenty of other stories for them as well. For one, flappers and prohibition were two major events to be written about. With the newspapers being plentiful and the people being kept informed, there was little the people were unaware of in society. The 1920s also brought advances in public education, medicine, and science. It was a time of great innovation and bettering the lives of everyday people. Life was getting better and better for many people during this time. The United States was fresh out of World War I with a flourishing economy. The problem behind this, however, was the economic crisis in 1920 to 1921 that would eventually lead to the Great Depression just as the Roaring Twenties ends. The 1920s was filled with cultural changes that affected everyone, whether they were one of the ones to embrace it or not. Women were given the right to vote. After that, there was no controlling them, and so changed their style and behavior with their new sets of freedom. Prohibition is put into place after much debate about it, and it ultimately fails because it only leads to more smuggling into the United States. The Jazz Age changed the popular music influence throughout the 1920s and future music that would be created. This time period became known as the Cultural War. With so many changes so quickly, it challenged the traditional way of life, which many were used to, and found it difficult to accept so many changes at once. The 1920s brings about a more modern way of thinking with advances within education, medicine, etc. that help better the United States as a whole. Although this was a time of great prosperity in America, it would come to an end, which would lead to the Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt would be elected to help deal with the Great Depression with his New Deal plan. Although Roosevelt's New Deal plan would greatly decrease the effects of the Great Depression, it would not be fully over until World War II, when the country returns to a wartime economy. This is the boom and bust theory of the time period and leaves the country in the worst depression in the nation's history. The years 1920 to 1929 brought the United States much excitement and the change that would eventually lead to the collapse within the economy. Cultural change during the 1920s is what helped push the United States in a more modern thinking direction.